Coming up on 60 Minutes.
Nothing will stop me from keeping my word.
Donald Trump 2.0.
Nobody can out-Trump Trump.
To the victor go the spoils.
He was president before, and the world didn't end.
We're in a brave new world.
But what does his win mean for Australia?
Trump prides himself on being unpredictable.
That's next on 60 Minutes.
What a campaign. What an election. What a result. To the victor, Donald Trump, go the spoils. From early next year, he'll return to the White House for another 4 years as the most powerful man on earth. And for someone with such an unpredictable and egotistical nature, that old saying, we live in interesting times, couldn't be more apt. But now that we've had a few days to process Trump's extraordinary and impressive resurrection, it's time to seriously consider the impacts his return to the Oval Office will have for Australia and the rest of the world. A joyous and wholesome scene. So far removed from the MAGA mania we're used to. Donald Trump's inner circle of family and supporters joining in a traditional Christian hymn. Moments after he declared victory.
Frankly, this was, I believe, the greatest political movement of all time. There's never been anything like this in this country, and maybe beyond.
Their redeemer, soon to be the 47th President of the United States, risen from political ruin, propelled by the anger and frustration of millions.
It is an FU to those in charge over the last 4 years that promised to unite the country and didn't, promised to hear the voices of the unheard and didn't, promised to make a meaningful, measurable difference in the quality of life of everyone and didn't. And finally, they just said, F you. It was wrong, and it led the coverage.
Unlike so many of us, renowned Republican pollster Frank Luntz isn't surprised by the election result. Since Trump declared victory, I've had so many messages saying, how could Americans choose Donald Trump?
My job is public opinion, and it's to measure the hopes and fears of the American people and the reactions that they have to elected officials and the people who govern them. Right now, fewer Americans trust the institutions that govern them than ever before. Fewer Americans trust the people who run those institutions. And it's in that environment that Donald Trump got brought back into office. They were prepared to take Trump at his worst over Harris at her worst. He was the vote of the people who had enough. He won because the American people said, I don't want this anymore. I will take you, Mr. Trump, and all that baggage because I believe you're most likely to bring about the change that this country needs.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. Kamala, you're fired. Get out of here. You're fired.
It's hard to fathom a civil and respectful America after such an unhinged and almost fatal presidential campaign. With a late change of candidates, 2 assassination attempts, and an explosive Donald Trump personally ridiculing his rival, Vice President Kamala Harris, and everything she stood for.
Certainly the dumbest vice president, and would be beyond the dumbest president, but we're not going to let that happen. I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black.
Did the Trump camp nail the campaign, or did the Harris camp blow it?
It's a great question. And I believe it's more that the Harris campaign blew it.
I mean, he unravelled at the end of the
hurting him.
campaign.
And yet the public still said, I'd rather have Trump unraveled and unplugged than Harris focused and determined. Because in the end, she didn't understand, she couldn't feel America. She felt her America. And that Trump ended up being a better voice for more people. That anger that he articulates, that he shows, is an anger inside tens of millions of Americans. And they thought that he was better for them, better for the country. And they'd say to you, in my focus groups, again and again, I don't like him, but I don't have to like my president. I don't like what he says. I don't like what he does.
I don't like the way he treats women.
No, I don't like any of that. But I still think that he's a better president for affordability and security.
This is what democracy looks like.
Women's reproductive rights, a primary focus for the Democrats, ultimately failed to block Donald Trump's road back to the White House. Billed as a men versus women election, Trump easily overcame the large gender gap. In her quest for the female vote, Kamala Harris alienated men.
And I was very surprised about this. I was doing focus groups every single week, often 2 in a week's time. And we started to talk to men who were Democrats, who voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, so it's not an anti-female vote. And they voted for Joe Biden in 2020, so it's not an anti-Democrat vote. But they voted for Trump over Harris because they thought she didn't like them. They thought they were being ignored, forgotten, and even dismissed. And it made them angry. It was the perfect moment to be able to say to the Democratic nominee and to America, we have a voice. And just because we're male, just because we have benefited from the hierarchy, doesn't mean you can push us down. And it was a vote of resentment. It was a vote of, listen to me.
Donald Trump successfully harnessed the anger of fed-up, struggling, working-class Americans while projecting his own grievances onto his loyal base.
Because I'm being indicted for you, and never forget, our enemies want to take away my freedom because I will never let them take away your freedom. I will never let that happen.
The 78-year-old spent a decent chunk of his campaign in courtrooms.
Guilty! Guilty! Guilty!
Remarkably, his convictions only fueled his following.
Donald Trump's inauguration is still 2 months away, but the stage is already being built here in the exact place where his supporters stormed the Capitol, trying to interfere with the 2020 election result. It's now extremely unlikely the president-elect will face any legal consequences for the insurrection, nor many of the other charges hanging over him. The Department of Justice is looking at ways to wind down the federal cases against Donald Trump, in keeping with a policy that bars the prosecution of sitting presidents.
I can't imagine in this country prosecuting someone who's the president of the United States. But I want you to consider this. Indicted 91 times, convicted more than 30 times, impeached twice, accused of sexual assault, accused of lying to the American people. We've never had this from a losing candidate, and we just had someone with all of this baggage elected president of the United States. Boy, my country has changed. I don't recognize it now.
Unrecognisable and unpredictable, Donald Trump takes the reins at a perilous moment in time, with the most instability and conflicts since World War II. And as you'll see, many are worried. Could we see World War III?
We are edging ourselves towards a much more confrontational world than we have seen.
The world in 2024 is rife with conflict and uncertainty. as war rages in Europe and the Middle East.
Now, Israeli airplane overhead.
It's a vastly different landscape to the last time Donald Trump held the keys to the White House. We know what a Trump presidency looks like. Can world leaders be confident in how to work with Donald Trump?
Well, we know what Trump presidency the first time around looks like. This one's going to be different. He is more secure in his own instincts. He has less constraints on the policy advisors that he has around him. Not only is he older himself, but he feels very vindicated this time around.
Charles Adell runs a global think tank in Washington, D.C. and works closely with the Biden administration.
How do you feel about the future of your country?
Well, I think we've got a lot of questions here about what things will look like on the domestic front, how much churn there will be, how much upheaval. Those are big questions for America, but also what that means for America's role in the world.
He warns Donald Trump's haphazard and egotistical approach to foreign policy will be difficult for America's allies and potentially dangerous. In his first term in office, President Trump was critical of NATO, America's oldest security alliance with Europe, blasting member nations for not pulling their weight on defence spending.
Trump himself said that if you don't pay what he terms fair payment, the protection, as he terms the alliance, is over.
Do you think he may actually withdraw the US from the NATO alliance?
Well, it's unclear. Trump prides himself on being unpredictable and not being clear about what his endpoints are because he can always negotiate further. I think the truth is we do not know, but the volatility will have real effect and will have real effect on allied capitals.
In becoming the 47th president, Donald Trump assumes life and death responsibility. He will take over negotiating peace between Israel and Gaza.
We are with Israel 100%. Thank you, baby. Thank you.
And with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as one of his closest allies, any ceasefire will likely come at the expense of Palestinians. Trump has also vowed to end Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine on his first day in the job. I mean, what does that look like? What could that look like?
There are not details. It would probably mean a lot more pressure on Ukraine to settle, to renounce its claims to its own territory. The United States cannot make peace for Ukraine, so that is a decision that will be made in Kyiv, not in Washington.
And if Donald Trump were to pull US support from Ukraine and Vladimir Putin wins some Ukrainian territory, I mean, what message does that send to other dictators?
Well, you know, this is a really important question you've brought up because consistently what we hear from several of the advisors within the Trump orbit is that the reason that Donald Trump is not a fan of what's happening in Ukraine, i.e. the Ukrainians fighting back against Russia, is because the Europeans need to handle this. And America cannot afford to take its eye off the ball of the most important strategic competition, which is in Asia and against China. Trump has an affinity towards authoritarian leaders. There is no doubt about that. He likes the trappings of power. He likes the back and forth of great power politics. The question, I think, is whether or not we'll see ourselves over the next several years in a world where those actors who are destabilizing the entire world will continue to see this as a period of uncertainty, of chaos, and of churn that they can move forward their own interests.
As Australia Chair at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, Charles regularly consults with the Albanese government on trade, defence and security. You spend a lot of time in Canberra. What are they really thinking and saying?
The greatest concern to the Australian government is America that's simply less engaged, that's less invested, that's less present.
But are they worried?
Of course they're worried. Of course they're concerned. When there are question marks in front of you that you don't know the answer to, that you don't know the outcome of, and you don't know what your partner will do, that's when questions multiply. That's true across the board when we talk about trade, when we talk about climate, when we talk about defense issues. whether or not those initiatives are likely to accelerate forward, kind of tread water, or just be blown up entirely.
The greatest fear for many people is that no one really knows what Trump 2.0 will bring. He was president before, and the world didn't end, although it felt like it sometimes.
He was president before. The world did not end, but we did see advances taken by China, taken by Russia, taken by North Korea during his presidency.
Could we see World War III?
We are edging ourselves towards a much more confrontational world than we have seen. The prospect for not only conflict, but metastasizing conflict in multiple parts of the world is larger than it has been. Whether or not that means World War III is an open question.
But a terrifying one.
But a terrifying one.
I only want to be a dictator for one day.
For all the uncertainty, one thing is clear. An overwhelming majority of Americans have given Donald Trump a second chance. And, like it or not, pollster Frank Luntz says that the show will go on.
You could not imagine seeing a political story like this.
These are extraordinary times.
We fight. We fight like hell.
The return of Donald Trump was impossible on January 7th, 2021. It was impossible.
He was gone. He was politically dead.
Done and probably heading to jail. And now he's president of the United States. Go figure. But you know what? In democracies, lots of stuff happen that's unpredictable. When the public says, I've had enough, listen to them. When they say, I want a change, pay attention. And if they're mad as hell, don't reject it, don't insult it, but embrace it. Because in the end, Donald Trump read America better than most of us. And he understood exactly what the country was looking for. And that's why the impossible became reality.
This week's 60 Minutes podcast, Extra Minutes, is a great discussion about the extraordinary US election.
Could this be World War III? I mean, some of that's not unreasonable because Trump himself has very inflammatory rhetoric and he has threatened to pull out of NATO, for example. He's long criticised that alliance. He said he's going to end the Ukraine war on day one.
That's Extra Minutes, available now on your favourite podcast apps.